Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much indeed for coming. My name is Jonathan Isserby. I am the Director of the Growth Commission. It's great to have you here, both in the flesh and indeed to those who are watching the live stream, either live now or after the event on YouTube. The Growth Commission, I hope you're well aware, is a group of 13 international economists who are modelling fiscal and policy proposals to establish exactly the kind of measures that need to be implemented to deliver economic growth in advanced Western economies, using in particular advanced economic modelling, dynamic economic modelling, I should say, and looking in particular at GDP per capita as the measure of whether living standards are increasing or not. There's a leaflet on your chair which sets out a bit more about who we are and what we do. Do look at our website. Do sign up for our occasional email updates. There's a QR code on that leaflet that will help you do that. It's my pleasure to introduce our two speakers today, who is not so much speeches as a conversation they're going to have. Shanker Singham is the chairman of the Growth Commission. Shanker is one of the world's leading international trade experts. He's been an advisor to both the US Trade Representative and to the UK Trade Secretary, and he has many books and publications to his name. And speaking with him today is Andrew Griffith, the Member of Parliament for Arundel and South Downs since 2019, somebody who has served the last three Conservative Prime Ministers in a number of different guises, as Minister for Exports, Minister for Science, as a Treasury Minister, and head of the Downing Street Policy Unit. He also has an extensive career in business before he was a Member of Parliament, so he does know a thing or two about growth. Please give him a warm welcome.
Thank you very much, Jonathan and Andrew. It's great to have you. We've put a graph up to sort of frame our conversation. And the graph, just by the way, it actually came from a conversation you and I had earlier on about the gap between GDP per capita that the UK could gain versus what the trajectory that we're actually on. So if you look at the graph, the lower two lines are sort of the historical trend based on the last 13, 14 years. The OBR projection. OBR obviously is all over the place on its projections, but this is a projection. And then a sort of regulatory reform potential scope where we've also included tax reform. But we're going to talk principally about the levers of economic growth that you in your department, which is huge, have. So aside from tax, welfare reform and maybe some productivity issues, most of the economic levers are really in your wheelhouse, essentially. So what we wanted to do, Andrew, was break this into like a couple of areas. We're going to talk about the trade issues, certainly, but we'll talk about them after we've talked about the domestic regulatory reform issues. That's largely because in our Growth Commission modelling, it's domestic regulatory reform that has a huge impact, and we've modelled some of those changes. So, if from a Growth Commission perspective, the way we look at the world is, are you, and it's not just in the UK, it's throughout the G7 and beyond. Do you have a society that is aspiration based? Where competition on the merits is the organising economic principle, willing buyer, willing seller, voluntary exchange. Does the government's role limited to protecting your property, yourself, your security, and guaranteeing your economic freedom? And that's it. And if that's the sort of overarching sort of moral philosophy, everything you say sort of flows off that. So in that context, we're going to cover a couple of a few regulatory issues first. So you've obviously done a lot of work on the Employment Rights Bill. Yeah. Labour market flexibility in our modelling is a huge driver of economic growth. In fact, we've made recommendations that not only should you the Labour government do the Employment Rights Bill, but you should actually have a look at how to make labour markets more flexible than they currently are, particularly in an AI world. So talk to us a little bit about your vision for the labour market in terms of that sort of flexibility and AI and all these things that are coming at us.
Well, Thank you, Shanker. It's great to be here. Thank you to the Taxpayers Alliance, wonderful organisation, for allowing us to host here. And this is the most important conversation, not because I'm here, but because if we don't grow, there's not just no future for the Conservative Party, for a party of the centre-right that believes in people keeping their own private capital and making their own decisions, but without exaggeration, arguably, democracy itself is under challenge. And we already see a tension whereby the extreme right and the extreme left dominate much more of the debate. That's because, in my view, the flywheel of if you make this compact with the state that you suborn some of your rights in a democratic organisation, in return, you, your children, your grandchildren will have a better life, a better, often longer, higher quality life. So if we don't fix this, and you can see from the very, very anemic levels of growth that may even yet prove optimistic, because the story of the OBR forecast, just taking those as a central case, is of serial downgrades. The forecasts that are made here today, that line moves. It doesn't follow along the trajectory. They just shift it each year to the right. Yep. That's the scale of the challenge we face. Now, let me turn to the labour market. Look, you're absolutely right. Clearly, two things. One is, if you're in a hole, stop digging. And the 330-page, 120,000 words of employment rights bill, the unemployment rights bill as I call it, is enormously damaging. Flexible labour markets are one of the few things we've got left to compete with, and this removes at a stroke essentially all of the flexibility of the labour market that Blair and Brown accepted as part of running a market-based economy. And you're all a far too young a crowd, but it essentially takes us back to the 1970s and go look at some textbooks or Wikipedia to see just what labour relations and how dynamic the economy was in the 1970s. You're also right, Shanker, that what we should be doing, without getting too far into specific proposals, is looking at the opportunities for much more flexible labour markets. It could be micro-contracting. I talked yesterday about the need for us as a Conservative Party to look again at reform of IR35. Right? IR35 is a real rigidity. I'm sorry that happened in the past. It wasn't on my watch, because that was an interference. We won't get into the details of what it was, but it was an interference in the right of people to freely trade their labour in an informed way and organise their affairs as they feel fit. And you think about a world of digital nomads, of people operating in multi-jurisdictions, the work from home revolution that means people can work more flexibly, some of the other challenges in society, the challenge of people being sandwich carers for a young generation and an elderly generation at the same time. Why is our employment contract model so vanilla, so unreformed that it would be recognisable to the late Victorian era? Right, one contract, one employer, preordained ordinary form of hours. There should be much more with the basic protections that we would all recognise. There should be a much more dynamic set of opportunities. And that's like, someone put it to me, it's not original, but someone said it's like discovering a country almost the size of the Republic of Ireland, full of people who are keen to work but are not doing so. Right? What are the rate limiting factors of the UK economy? Well, I'll argue that we don't always price capital and regulate capital properly, but often the rate limiting factor for a business, thing that means it can't expand, a pub, a restaurant, a business can't add more hours of the week, is the availability of somebody to do that work. And so you go and discover a pool which we have today of 9 million people of working age who are not currently in gainful employment. I mean, that could be a game changer. I suspect that's in some of, shifting that, it's not a nice language. Just don't take me out of context. But, if you're on welfare, you're sort of on the liability side of the ledger. If you're in work, you're contributing both to the growth of the economy and often through the tax system to the revenues that the government has available to itself. That is an outsized opportunity. And so more opportunities for more diversity of people contracting. There's some things I'd like to look at again. Paid time off for union workers. I mean, it gets a lot worse in the unemployment rights bill, but the status quo that we've tolerated for a very long time has a big productivity drain, because if there's lots of people on your payroll, this typically is in the public sector these days, who are literally not paid to operate, not paid to sweep the roads, not paid to administer the local council, but are using paid time on trade union activity, that is just a productivity sink. And so there's lots of things like that we should be looking at.
Well, it's certainly included in the in that difference between those two curves.
In general, we do overtax. We overtax. I'm not going to make tax policy here, but as a society, we tend to overtax employment. And we overtax property a bit. And if you could nudge those, you would simply, as we know, if you reduce the price of something, you get more of it. And so if we're able to do anything in time over the cost of employing people, then that would get more of the people into work and more towards the top end of those lines.
Yeah, I mean, we've estimated that the Employment Rights Bill in its sort of full form would cost the economy anywhere between 2 and 5% GDP per capita over a 10-year period, which is a significant...
It's significant in an economy that's not growing that much.
No, I mean, we're already in the wrong direction, but so that is important. But if you look at labour markets now, I think something's happening in labour markets, and this is very relevant to what you said about labour force participation rates. The Chancellor, the Shadow Chancellor, talked about the AI impact on labour markets in the future. I think the future is now. We're starting to see now massive deterioration in labour markets in the US, in the UK. Basically, any economic recovery we have is going to be a jobless recovery. So at this point, getting more flexibility in the labour market for that young cohort you talked about is going to be absolutely critical. So how do you see the AI sort of component here?
Well, that's why I feel strongly about IR35. It's why I talked yesterday about creating a new generation of entrepreneurs. Because if the counterfactual is there are fewer, preordained, what some people call, I don't like the term, but some people call white collar jobs, knowledge-based jobs, but at a low level of intensity. One of the big opportunities, and I wouldn't be doing my job if I wasn't hugely optimistic and believer in the British people, one of the counterfactual opportunities to set up their own enterprise. There are millions of successful enterprises yet to be founded, yet to scale. And so if we can reduce the barriers to that to me counts twice. Counts twice because it is a viable option. You look at the number of I know you'll have a big Etsy habit going on, Shanker, but if you look at the number of businesses, side hustles on Etsy, that if you could remove the frictions, digital has removed a lot of the physical frictions. You don't need a premise, you don't need adverts in a paper to find your customers. But believe me, it's still blooming hard to open a bank account, and dealing with HMRC is something else. So if we can reduce some of our frictions, that is one opportunity. Yeah,
I think some people don't talk about the opportunities, that particular, the small businesses that would actually benefit significantly from AI. You don't have to be a big business with huge numbers of employees anymore. But let's switch to energy. So obviously we've talked about energy cost in the UK. It's 4 or 5 times what it is in the US. There have been lots of things that have been embedded from the Climate Change Act of 2008 and on that have contributed to this increasing cost of energy. Obviously, there's the announcement that you'll be repealing the Climate Change Act of 2008. We in the Growth Commission have made that recommendation several times over the last couple of years. So we're
big
pleased
win, big shout out for Growth
we're
Commission.
Pleased to see that. But we have also looked at the impact of elimination of the Climate Change Act, but also the emissions trading scheme, the CBAM, all of those things, as between about 3.9 and 5.4% GDP per capita. That's the injection into the UK economy over the next 10 years. Just doing that, because the benefits go way beyond electricity price. They're all over the economy. So can you talk a little bit about...
And that's removing ETS, or just harnessing, shackling our ETS to the European Union?
You could have an ETS, but it wouldn't be linked to the European version, and you would eliminate the CBAM. You wouldn't have a carbon border adjustment mechanism. Interestingly, when we did the analysis of the CBAM, separately before the Climate Change Act announcement, we also looked at alternative measures of dealing with climate change, including a trade remedy based on if you have a country that's deliberately, degrading its environmental standards for trade advantage. And we actually found that you could actually gain, you could have gains to GDP per capita if you did that. But what's the energy is in everything. So you cannot be a business secretary without having a really close focus on energy.
And it's in AI. I mean, the cost of AI is almost exclusively energy.
Right.
Look, very concerned about any sort of carbon border tariff.
Yeah.
Right? It's just a tariff by another name. I'm Business and Trade Secretary, and anything that erects trade frictions just at a moment when we've arrived ourselves, not quite Goldilocks, but we certainly have that opportunity of trading with everybody, consumers benefit, manufacturers and importers benefit from that. So it's a real concern that the government sounds like it's too keen on carbon tariffs, particularly the European Union CBAM version. That could impede. Even now, the Prime Minister's doing something right this week. He's in India. He's talking about trade with a very large growing market. What could be one of the impedances to consummating an attractive deal, or a deal where we have the maximum amount of advantage? It could be India's understandable concerns about imposing carbon border tariffs. So that is a real concern. You heard a lot, I think you've heard a lot of this conference from Claire and others about removing the policy costs from energy. From repealing the Climate Change Act, and that of course is hugely welcome. We've got to be very careful, and this is on the wider supply side piece, is of course we will remove a lot of the policy costs, but that doesn't include, for example, the costs of building a grid. So as I understand it, implicit within our policies is still acknowledging that, as you'd expect, that standing charges and energy includes a contribution to the cost of the grid. That is where our old friend sort of just supply side deregulation is really important, because the cost of building that grid is going to be impacted by planning delays, environmental regulations, which is an area of work that we now look at as what are the downstream environmental regulations that are holding us back. Even mad ideas like the landfill tax that the government is imposing. Well, who pays landfill tax? Very large part of that will be paid by infrastructure providers. So, just as with energy, all of the costs or the inefficiencies on supply side processes end up back in there. And if we just end up with an elevated energy costs because of the costs of building the grid, that's just another penal penalty for us.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, planning, I mean, that's a good segue into the next topic, which is of course planning. And one of the things, the Prime Minister, when he became Prime Minister...
You're very expansive about my portfolio. To be clear, it's not planning, but I will always be a full-throated voice for business. So we can go into this on the back of, if we don't grow, we're all dead, so we need to grow. And business and private capital, for whom I am your champion, will always...
And business doesn't make these differentiations all the time. We just want a successful policy that actually leads to economic growth.
Correct.
And so with regard to planning, Prime Minister, when he came in, talked about the growth was the most important thing the government could deliver, by which he meant, as he said, wealth creation and household income. So even GDP per capita, as we in the Growth Commission always talk about and focus on. When we looked at planning reform, it is this is a big mover. It's about a third of that gap in the UK. 3 to 6% GDP per capita over the next 15 years, largely because it takes so long for these effects to flow through the economy. But it very much depends on what you mean by planning reform. So we've modelled a sort of minimal scenario and a maximal scenario in terms of planning reform, and you see it's very much a sort of exponential. The biggest gains you get from the biggest changes, obviously. And one of the things we've picked up is, unless you deal with statutory consultees and the judicial review process and all of these impediments, you're not really going to see significant benefits from planning reform. So without getting into other portfolios, talk a little bit about your vision of planning reform and what you think is needed in order to capture that third difference between these curves.
Having spent a lot of time in different guises bumping up against the whole issue of planning reform, I am now persuaded that we need a big bang reform. I wouldn't even talk about reform anymore. I think we need planning big bang 2.0 because incrementalising it has not worked. We just have to acknowledge that. We tried, this government is trying the incremental point. Exactly to your point, it's a non-linear function. You either dispense selectively with a lot of the corpus, or you just run more quickly into the next fence, but the fence and the impedances are still there. So what does that mean? It means going to situations where you've got, for example, brownfield. I was talking to a port. I don't know, anyone run a port here? I was talking to one of the UK's biggest port operators yesterday. Now, a port is your absolute classic brownfield redevelopment. They've often got good energy tails connecting into them. They're not normally adjacent to residential areas, and by definition, there's a lot of derelict space from the old. We don't have stevedores in the same way we used to. Now there. The old conservative vision of a free zone being a free-for-all zone where almost all other than health and safety to a certain level rules don't apply, we never fully realised because it was too incremental and there was always a vested interest that got in the way. So I wouldn't pivot the planning debate always around a greenfield site, replete with nature, because I think there's so many opportunities to just do some big bang reform that would actually get Britain moving, particularly from a business perspective, more of these permissive development rules. So rather than say, well, you go through a slightly deformed planning process, you effectively get a access all areas pass that says, don't get in my way for this particular perimeter of development. Business curtilage within that, change of use, I can just go straight through. I don't have to get bogged down into all of the processes you talk about. Judicial review is about much more than just planning. I mean, judicial review is a chilling mechanism on every license, every piece of regulation, every CMA decision. The whole regulatory space is cowed by the constant idea that not only have they got public criticism looking over their shoulder, but they've also got potential litigation risk. And so, we have to reform profoundly judicial review. I was a law student a gazillion years ago. I did not ever practice law. I don't want to overclaim. But when I was a law student, the entire corpus of judicial review was like 2.5 volumes. And I'm not that old. And it dealt with the most egregious examples of state overreach, right? Which I think most people would legitimately reflect that there's a role for the judiciary in that. I mean, now it's a whole blooming wing of a law library. There's, enormous part of public law. I saw the figures for the most recent quarter. There were 904, that is 10 a day, applications for judicial review. You can't run an economy on that basis. Now everyone is trying to second guess everything through the courts. That cannot be right, and that has to be reformed. And without that, we're doomed. We're becoming world class in judicial review, right? And that's a near record high. That 904 judicial review applications in one quarter.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. You mentioned ports. Obviously,
it's much bigger than ports, but that's it's just a really good example, right? Why would we have any plan?
Yeah, no, I mean, the whole judicial review and the timing of when the statutory consultees weigh in and how that's used to further delay the process. I mean, all of these things. We've, in the Growth Commission, recommended completely repealing and replacing the Town and Country Planning Act because we agree with you that you need to have a complete reset of this.
Yeah, and you have to be. And one of the things I learned about trying to reform, and we did reform, the financial services regulations, and we know this from business, is that culture eats strategy, right? And so even if you can change some of the statutes, you can put some new growth duties in them. The muscle memory of these big organisations, the behaviour of the middle-ranking people who are actually day-to-day impeding and opposing changes, it's like super hard to change that. And that's why I'm much more like, okay, when we go again, it's got to be more big bangy. In whatever domain we apply planning reform, legal reform.
Yeah. Yeah, and just the port point on free ports was, I think the intention was a lot of these sorts of reforms could be explored and tested in the free ports. So unfortunately what we're seeing is that the bureaucracy is actually arguably even worse in the free ports and more restrictive of trying to do these things. You also mentioned the CMA. So one of the things we talked at the outset of this conversation was the competition on the merits as an organising principle, and the role of the competition authority in that. And that is also part of, not it's an independent regulator obviously, but within your sort of overall ambit. One of the concerns, and we will get into trade, one of the concerns that the US has with competition authorities in the UK, in Europe, in Japan, in Korea, is the way they operate. So this idea that big is bad, we need to do lots of interventions, we need to look at competition policy and transactions that are entirely nothing to do with the UK and intervene in those. Give us a reflection on your view of how you think competition policy plays into all of this.
Look, I think I'm not going to be careful. I mean, they're independent, but we're allowed to have views on the public policy side of things. I think they're a bit trigger happy. I think the way in which they operate, which is typically to sort of put everything to a first stage review, and then if they can't answer the question quickly enough, they push you into a second stage or they stop the clock. And so, again, with a lot of regulation, it's as much, if not more so, the clock speed, right? The takeaway from this session is we need to improve the clock speed of the UK economy. And so accepting there'll always be public policy decisions and a balance between market dominance, competition, lowering barriers to new entrants, which you need in a dynamic economy. So there's a good public policy debate. You've got to operate this at a faster clock speed than one that typically means that we're taking 18 months, 24 months to review a transaction. The counterfactuals they use and the market definitions, in my view, are too narrow. This has been particularly true in digital, where they've defined markets much more narrowly. And you look at, I won't name companies, it gets invidious, but companies are much more easy able to pivot into different industries and have very large addressable markets, and big companies, ultimately are all competing with each other. So too trigger happy, too slow. Their theories of harm can be a little bit convoluted, and the barriers before the threshold before an intervention should be much higher. I hear you about the piece about sort of extrajudiciality. And that should be looked at.
One of the things the US has done, actually, the Trump administration has an executive order, not on the private antitrust enforcement, but an executive order on basically a DOJ FTC task force to look at anti-competitive regulation in the US. So it's not just the new trade policy and the alignment on trade, but also domestically. Is that something that the UK might consider doing? And it's not a new thing. I mean, this is something the OECD has talked about for decades. That would be a really good way of forcing another dimension into the regulatory reform process.
Yeah, I like that. So look, we're here to learn and listen. So I'll take that one away. I think in general, the action of regulators, and we have very many, and we need to take a chainsaw to them, to the volume of personnel, not any one individual person, to be clear, but the volume of people has expanded far too significantly, and there's probably a case for consolidating quite a lot of the regulators. A lot of the sectoral regulators could actually, if they were doing their job well, could sit in something a bit more like a competition authority. But of course, the more regulation you have, that of itself is an anti-competitive practice. That is or often the biggest barrier to entry. And that's more the axis I wanted to work on, I was thinking about, was if you can prepare back the regulators, you will get more new entrants, whether they're firms from overseas coming here. I mean, look, I just hot-footed it from a meeting or a panel sponsored by Revolut. Right? Revolut is a fantastic global success. It is a unicorn. It is a British headquartered company. It is a challenger within the world of financial services, which matters to all of us because it mobilizes capital. They still haven't got a blooming license. I was advised by Treasury officials not to meet with them during the period of them applying for a license, which of course I ignored. But you know, and that's a barrier to entry, right? We could have 10 Revoluts. We haven't, because it's so hard to overcome all of the licensing and regulatory requirements. That I mean, whether you've got that one on your wish list or not, that to me is a real impedance to the growth rate in the UK.
Yeah, we absolutely do. I mean, the point is, you know, are you pushing through a competition principle into everything that you do? And that was the sort of, I think, the idea of the growth duty, but it was essentially suborned by other duties, such as environmental sustainability and various other things that got added to it. But I think a competition principle driven through all regulation. I mean, that is, after all...
So you and I are slightly different, because you sort of believe in almost a good regulation. I mean, my general disposition is to get out of the way, because even when you give regulators a competition mandate, you know, they'll often use that to sort of reach into other parts of the domain. Sometimes you need dynamic consolidation, which can actually... you know, benefit the UK.
I think we're.
But they'll follow a theory out the window.
I think we're the same in terms of what does competition mean. Which is we would say consumer welfare enhancement, maximisation of productive efficiency, allocative efficiency. It is the opposite of the way the CMA operates. So I'm very wary of getting the CMA involved too much in something when they're operating under a wrong theory. So that, fair point. Okay, let's talk about trade. Massive global realignment thanks to Trump administration. What we've said in the Growth Commission on this, and we do a lot of work with the US administration, and what we've said is, look, you're not wrong to say that there are lots of barriers and distortions in other countries that we've done nothing about for 30 years. And that therefore there does need to be some sort of comprehensive alignment. And what's interesting is that all the topics we talked about before in terms of domestic regulation are now trade topics. They always have been trade topics, but they're now being called out explicitly as trade topics. And the administration, the US administration, is going to countries and saying, you have these problems. And actually, if you want to, they're quite a small group of major problems I think the US administration has. The UK has a lot of them. So you mentioned digital. So digital policy, things like the DMA, these sorts of things are real problems for the US administration. Operation of competition policy, the way the CMA operates, is a problem. Pharmaceutical patent protection and drug pricing. I mean, what the president has essentially said is, you've basically done all the research of the world on the basis paid for by the US consumer. We're not going to do that anymore. So there has to be a drug pricing discussion. That's going to be a very difficult one in the UK, but it has to happen. It's already happening. So in this sort of global realignment, where do you think the UK should position itself? Both with regard to a US deal, for which you'll have to do some things, and in terms of other countries and other agreements that we're part of, like the CPTPP, and you mentioned India and so on. Now, in that context, the elephant in the room that we can't ignore, and I think one area where there's a huge difference between your approach and the approach of the government, is the whole EU reset. And from a US perspective, the US would say, why are you aligning to the very EU regulation that we have opposed and is the reason for our reset, our realignment of trade? It's going to be a lot easier for the UK to get a zero tariff deal if we don't align to the EU system, whether it's SPS or other things. That seems to be where there's a very big difference between your approach and the government's approach.
Correct. That's exactly right. No further entanglement with the EU. The benefits, I mean, there's lots of work on this. The benefits on this are fairly ephemeral anyway. I mean, it's a political strategy the government is pursuing because of their learned muscle memory, their fetishism of being inside the EU, their 29 times voting to take us back and overturn the referendum, rather than a hard-headed economic conversation. You know, they're having some of those with some parts of the world, but that's not how we approach. Even from SPS, I'm all in favour of reducing friction. Right, I mean that we are the party of free trade. We can only get to a sort of levels of prosperity we need as a country from trade, and that involves removing frictions on both sides. But that's not where the government is coming from at all. And you know, being able to import fresh fruit a little bit easier for supermarkets from the EU doesn't help our farming, doesn't help our domestic production anyway. Another big difference is the word CPTPP have barely been uttered by the government. I mean, there was a point I looked at Hansard and the answer was zero. I don't want to repeat that because I haven't done that piece of work for a few weeks, and maybe that has changed. Now, you know, that was a foothold in a great axis of opportunity, and I've heard nothing from the government about how they seek to capitalise on the advantage of that. Last week I was in Taiwan, a fast-growing economy, super keen to trade and do more with us, but all of the government's focus seems to still be on tying us more closely into Europe. I've talked about a culture change in our embassies, and I was for a while the export minister, and it just made your heart sink, to be quite honest, the level of resources, the sort of cultural priorities that we gave to trade and finding new export markets. So breaking the closed shop of ambassadors only coming from the Foreign Office, very, very seldom levelled with a political appointment, and opening them up to the ranks of business leaders, former Lord Mayors of London, chairs of, you know, global banks. You know, that is a small cultural intervention, but with a view to sort of really drive how we think about this. I mean, trade should be a huge area of policy for this government and the next government.
Well, I mean, CPTPP accession was a marquee achievement of the previous government and of UK trade policy in general. I should point out that almost all of those CPTPP countries have, well, they all have the same problem the US has with European SPS and other regulation. But there are lots of countries that want to accede to the CPTPP. It is a incredibly important agreement, as you say.
And could be a framework. I mean, you know, could be an alternative framework to the, you know, WTO, certainly to the failed European Union bloc, you know, all of that.
So you got that. In the trade strategy that the government released, they sort of treated the US, the EU and China as sort of equivalent blocks that we need to have, you know, strategies to deal with. We see the world very differently, which is that there's a battle for the world's operating system, which is essentially between a regulatory competition sort of approach with lots of mutual equivalent adequacy and mutual recognition and equivalence and so forth, versus a harmonization model, which is the European model. It's also the China model, which is, you know, unless you copy my regulatory system, you can't have access to my market. Well, it sounds like you agree with that. With that,
I do, and I'm firmly in the mutual recognition camp, right? So rather than forced compliance.
So with that world view, what would your advice be to yourself when you become, hopefully you'll become the Business and Trade Secretary, but your advice generally to the government now would be what in terms of operationalising that?
Look, I think it would be to stop chasing the diminishing returns from Europe. I mean, some of that may or may not come. I've always held a slightly sort of human-centric view that it will require the leaders on both sides who are involved and participants at the time of Brexit to move on, because it's an emotional topic. It's not a rational topic. It's an emotional topic, and you know, one or two more moves in the French polity, and you know, and some better noises coming out of Germany, and you may move to a point where that becomes more of an administrative, technical conversation. I still wouldn't support, you know, dynamic alignment, to be very clear, but you could move that into just like a practical, fungible problem, right? How do you properly implement trusted trader schemes?
Yes,
How do you get closer to mutual recognition? We have de facto alignment anyway, so what's the problem? Let's remove the frictions. People are going to have the freedom to unalign at some point in the future, and if they do, let's have another conversation then. We don't need to litigate all of this hard wiring, which has always been the European approach.
Yeah, yeah.
And on the US, I mean, no one likes saying this. I think you believe this, but they're more right than wrong, right? So everyone throws up their hands when they impose unilateral tariffs, and as a free trader, I do not welcome that. But the work that they've done on non-tariff barriers show that economically, you're about the same, you're about a wash. I am very worried about pharmaceuticals. I can't properly translate that worry, but we should all be worried about that. Second largest industry in the UK. The fact these are not accidents. The fact that Astra has suspended development on their R&D centre, the fact that they're now procuring a listing in the US, the fact that Glaxo, at the time of the US presidential visit, committed to invest, I think, $30 billion, in the US in manufacturing and development. There is a very clear direction of travel, and it looks like government ministers are the only ones on earth who cannot see what's going on with one of our single largest industries.
Yeah, I do want to come to the audience for questions, so start thinking about your questions now. Just on that point, though, I think there is a possibility for a joint, much as we do with defence, or we've done with defence, a joint US-UK sort of production area, if you will, for pharmaceuticals, because there's a number of things the US has done that are difficult for companies, like the H-1B visa. The access to the NHS data sets is very, it's very sought after. You could get some sort of global, agreement on pharma that would preserve the UK's position, but the industry is under obviously huge pressure to produce in the US now.
Yeah, and look, a lot of the challenges are not even they're certainly not of the US is making, and they're not necessarily of the moment. The issue about, which we will not go into because it's a world of pain, a wormhole of detail, but the issue about NHS pricing of medicines, NHS acting as a monopsonist procurer of medicines, has been with us for a very long period of time. And although it'll always be a commercial discussion, no one's going to fully agree, you do have to be in the room. And you do have to bring all of the wider equities to the fact that the UK, is also a major R&D and manufacturer in that space. I think, I get emails about it. I think the US access to the NHS data set is overblown. I think, that's fairly subordinate to, look, is this a big market? In the US terms, is this a big sort of captive that we can sell to a fair price? And that may or may not have utility.
Yeah, absolutely. So questions from the audience. Is there a microphone roving around? There's a lady in the front, over here.
Sophie Ng, Politico. I'm not following you, I promise, Andrew.
I feel stalked in a good way.
I just wondered if you could talk a bit more about your visit to Taiwan and what trading opportunities you see there, and also how you feel about Taiwan's accession to CPTPP. Thanks.
Look, I went to Taiwan because it's a good example of an East Asian tiger economy. The whole geostrategic point about semiconductors is something that has resonance to us all. There'll be a dozen semiconductors, within finger reach of you, and that's something that should concern the whole world. Actually, it's a really good example. If you could look through the geopolitics, which I'm not wholly qualified to talk to, it's a really good example of the law of comparative advantage. Here we've got a point of, global aggregation. They've built a supply chain that's fully integrated. They've used, their flexible but also highly skilled labour market to produce something of great utility and trade with the world. Now, there are obviously points. I mean, look, on CPTPP, I want to see that evolve into, a good global trading system with fast-growing economies who are committed to the rule of law. And so you'd look at Taiwan's accession within that. We'll pick that up, under advisement as and when we're in government. But clearly, I think that's a good and growing economy. And look, the other things to learn are, were about supply side, actually, about, what does a good industrial strategy look like? I don't have dogma about the words industrial strategy. That doesn't, to me, conjure up 1970s horrors. That can be one poor execution of it. But another way of saying it is just, could you please tell us clearly what your strategy is? Which sectors will be preferred or not preferred? When you do trade deals, who's going to be front of mind? And one of the things I would just observe on trade is, we've not heard much from the government about breaking down barriers on financial and professional services. So we all know on trade, the physical goods exchange is the easy stuff, but allowing a British architect, a financier, to work in India, allowing financial products to be sold cross-border, actually the UK has a great deal to benefit from that. And I think we get a bit defined by the symmetry of others. So cars are important, and I'm glad we've got to where we've got to, but we'll often end up talking more about the things that the other party wants to talk to. That is partly a failure to plan. It's partly a failure to fully understand and recognise the economy, and partly it's been a little bit of the sort of press release dopamine rush approach to trade that this government has done. They've sort of taken negotiations that were reasonably fraught but well advanced, and I think discarded some of the things that would have been harder but delivered bigger benefits in favour of what's been available to sort of get to a signature quickly. There isn't an Indian trade deal that I've seen. We haven't yet seen the full reduction in tariffs we were promised from the US. There's no clarity whatsoever on steel and pharmaceuticals, which again is a really big and important UK equity. I don't know, maybe you know, but I have no idea where that conversation with the US is, and until we know, there is real jeopardy.
And a classical example of that on India is, I think we've made some success on the sort of famous Scotch whisky tariff, but we've made very little progress on legal services access, which has been the big bugbear of the whole thing for the last 20 years.
Yeah. And I'm not always critical of the government, right? I'm pleased that in some domains they have got on and done some trade deals. So it's not just to be critical for critical's sake.
But your question also raises the issue of China. And I think what the US is going to demand from its partners is you're going to have a similar view to us on China. And which I don't think means decoupling. I think
because they have a trade deal with China.
Exactly. Yeah. I think it means where China is distorting its market, you have some mechanism to deal with that. That again, I think, is slightly different from the current government's approach, which seems to be more, Peter Kyle, the Secretary of State for Business and Trade, was out in China negotiating on trade. Not suggesting he shouldn't, but we've got to be very, very not naive, shall we say, on anything we do with China.
This is probably not an original thought, and I don't mean it to be, but it seems to me that having had almost for most of my adult lifetime post-GATT, a sort of very flat world view that you can trade with everybody and it's just your job is to lower tariffs and then eliminate other frictions thereafter. You've now got more of a wedding cake strategy. Yeah. So, you've got some tight, close coupled allies, the sort of AUKUS, Five Eyes, with whom you'll share everything. You'll engage probably on things like critical mineral sourcing. You'll be willing to share your defence supply chains in a very open way. But there's a pretty small group of nations who share our values in that top tier. Then a wider mercantilist tier, and then a wider tier of states that we should not close the door on because we believe in prosperity and trade, but where you may well be much more selective in terms of the sectors, and you've got to be a little bit more clear-eyed about the supply chain risks and consequences of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Other questions? There's a chap over there in the back row. Just say who you are and who you represent, if you represent someone.
Rob Harris, Chelsea and Fulham. Yep, there you go.
Okay.
One of the biggest barriers to productivity to me is the trade unions. Given we're at a time now where workers aren't being exploited, which is the whole purpose of them, should we just simply be banning trade unions for growth?
I wouldn't ban them. I'm not a banner. I don't want to ban very many things, and this government's banning way too many things. But I do think that where there are restrictive practices that enshrine trade unions. For example, in some sectors, only a trade union can accompany a worker to a disciplinary. right? Why not an employment lawyer? Why not somebody who's a professional mediator, negotiator? And that seems to me a very sensible piece of potential deregulation to say, well, in that environment, you can bring along your choice of representative, for example. And so I'd go more in that direction. You're quite right that, trade unions emerged in an era where there were no statutory protections at all for employment. We're now in an era where those statutory protections kick in from the hour you turn up for work, and you could join the queue of 491,000 other petitionants to the employment tribunal the same afternoon. So I think your general point is right. Banning is probably not the right way to go, but opening up any last residual elements of the closed shop definitely seem right. Look, the other thing we have to think about is trade unions and the productivity penalty that we all pay as a society as a consequence are, as of now, almost exclusively the preserve of the public sector or the formerly nationalised companies. Now, clearly, as the state has expanded and is going to take in new domains such as transport, there will be a moment again to look at, in general, how we operate those public sector organisations. Thanks for your question.
Other questions? Gentleman here in the jeans in the front row.
Thanks very much. Matthew Trimming from constituency.
Okay. Right.
This is not a plant. I have no idea what Matthew's going to ask.
You talked, both of you, about the cost of employing people, but also there's a cost of not employing people, i.e. structuring the people in your businesses, which is huge and not really talked about enough. So I'll just invite you both to say a few words on that.
The cost of not employing as in what?
Well,
restructuring?
Cost of getting rid of people.
Right, okay, yep.
Hiring people.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say, obviously we've said very clearly that, what makes it hard to fire someone makes it hard to hire someone, and that's what everyone has to sort of bear in mind with this. But Andrew,
Yeah, look, again, I mean, we should allow freedom of contract for informed consenting adults to go a long way, arguably further than we do today, underpinned by a floor of statutory protections, and particularly those parts of the economy where there may be an asymmetry. So people are not exploited, but above a certain level, people could have much more flexibility. And look, I just think the employment tribunal has been captured by the employment law profession. It is far too trigger happy, and the settlements are far too large. We have people who have won tribunal cases for a security guard working in Westminster who was working from home in Cornwall. We've got people who've been awarded, very significant five-figure payouts for being compared to Darth Vader. And then you've seen the much bigger cost to the public sector of cases as in Birmingham and Next on quite convoluted theories of harm around equalities law. So that's a whole other world of equalities and human rights law. But we've created this thicket that has just bogged down most human activity. And the human activity we're focused on today is about business and how we make our economy grow. So you're absolutely right.
well, having been referred to as Darth Vader myself, I'm looking forward to my five-figure payout. Let's go to...
I think my voice is rapidly heading that direction, by the way, so I may be in with a chance.
Gentleman over here in the cap.
Thanks for the discussion so far. I'm Ben Willard from Catalyst Think Tank. Is there an opportunity to introduce a small bit of friction for some frictionless internal growth in the UK in the form of takeover protection clauses? So you might know this from your Just Eat days, but a business invests in its own productivity, the share price plummets, and it leaves itself open to takeover, whereas lots of other countries, even the US, have takeover protection clauses for home-based organised businesses that want to invest in their own growth.
So I'll shoot from the hip a bit and sort of say essentially no. the best mechanism to, and I'm not dismissive of the harm that you speak of. The best protection about that is a vibrant, functioning capital market that you can communicate the investment case, the impact on short-term earnings, but the long-term benefit, and persuade the market to look through and back you. And many successful businesses do manage to do that. It's not always easy, but you've got to have a vibrant capital market that people want to invest in, because as now, the UK market feels a little bit underbought or under-demanded, then that is when there is risk that people will not hang around long enough to see those returns. I'll give you a slightly different version, though, of maybe some of the same issue, which is we're pretty rubbish at our own economic nationalism, if you like. So I was the Science and Research Minister. I mean, we spend an enormous amount of money, £22 billion a year. 110 billion pounds over a 5-year parliament on research and development and innovation and PhDs and all this other stuff, right? And it's a good amount of money, but it's not always looked at through enough of, because that is public money, right? That's not interfering in the market. The market intervention, the state is already showing up on that one. And so, for example, an Innovate UK grant, where we have co-created and co-funded IP, we're often quite negligent about that then at a later stage going overseas. And I would be quite aggressive in terms of having some explosive repayment clauses. Let's say if UK PLC, UK taxpayers have co-funded an innovation, and then in a free capital market that I come down firmly on the side of, that then ends up overseas, that company is domiciled overseas, you might want some very, very significant returns to be paid back. And the same thing with other parts of the grant-based systems, the catalysts, which are good pro-business innovations. Even a small statist thinks that there can be some areas where we should pump prime or make industry meet academia on terms that are advantageous. But then we should follow that all the way through its life and not allow economic leakage to happen.
We've got time for one more question, so gentleman over here in the back.
Raul Jones Sanchez, Mitchman Morden. I was wondering, we speak about world trade in the idea that there are 3 main blocks. There's China, the EU, and the USA. We have...
Shanker did, because he's cleverer than me, but...
I was rejecting that.
I want to trade with everybody.
Yeah, sorry.
We have the Commonwealth, which is one of our greatest strengths.
Yes.
And I was wondering, do you think, instead of thinking, how do we align and trade with these other blocks, we create our own block in Kanzuk? We have a shared language, a shared culture, shared history. These are major developed economies. And I think, I was wondering what your opinion is. Should we create our own block rather than trying to trade with blocks that already exist?
Yes, what a brilliant idea. Kanzak today and the Commonwealth tomorrow. And these are nations that often share our heritage, our culture. They still, despite the best efforts of our Chancellor, they still look up to us. They've hunger for what we can do. They would absolutely love closer trade links. Often they've been prejudiced by our membership of the European Union. Okay. So spot on, young man. I'm sorry, I don't want to sound patronising, but it's lovely to have young people. And I think that's a really good access. And I have often thought that the Commonwealth is an area that we just don't give enough attention to. No one should be ashamed of our history. We should have pride in our Commonwealth, pride in the many accomplishments of the empire that preceded it, whilst not being, completely overlooking some of the other issues. And we should really seek to make the most of all of the soft power opportunities that we've got around that. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, the UK is in a great position, actually, because we have agreements with all of these countries. We're probably the only country that has agreements with the US, with all of those countries, with CPTPP, and with the EU and so on. So the UK is in a pretty strong, it could be in a strong position with regard to trade. Thank you very much, Andrew. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your engagement.
Thank you for your work.
And thank you for your ideas. We're going to close there, and Jonathan's going to give us a little benediction.
Thank you both very much indeed. A very fulfilling and provocative, thoughtful hour. I hope you'll agree. Thank you for all coming. Thank you to our friends at the Taxpayers Alliance for all you've done to make this happen. Thank you to Growth Commission donors, without whom nothing we could do would happen. Thank you for your support. If you're not already a Growth Commission donor and you'd like to become a Growth Commission donor, come and talk to me or Shanker afterwards. We are always keen to build up our support base. But all that remains is to me to ask you to thank our guest speakers in the usual way. Thank you.